Before we dive into this incredible tale, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I love connecting with my global audience, and if you want to discover how this story of humiliation transforms into an unexpected journey of self-discovery, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Let's get started. The soft golden glow of the Harbor's Edge restaurant flickered gently over pristine white linen tablecloths as Alexander Sterling, a man accustomed to the world bending to his will, strode through the entrance. His bespoke Italian suit, easily worth $5,000, hugged his athletic frame, and his polished leather shoes echoed against the gleaming hardwood floor, a rhythm seemingly set to the beat of his own importance. Alexander surveyed the elegant dining room with a critical eye. Tables were impeccably set, silverware gleamed under the warm light, and the aroma of exquisite dishes wafted through the air. Yet something in the decor unsettled him. Too many overtly local elements for his taste. Black and white photos of fishermen, nets hanging from the walls, and small, discreet maritime flags nestled among the potted plants. "Good evening, sir. Do you, have a reservation?" The young woman's voice, with its distinct, unfamiliar lilt, immediately grated on Alexander's nerves. He turned to face her, a young woman with simple brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, dressed in the restaurant's black uniform. Her green eyes sparkled with a mix of shyness and determination. But what most caught Alexander's attention was the way she pronounced her words, as if she had to think about each one before articulating it. "Yes, I have a reservation, Sterling. Table for 1 at 9, he replied curtly, noting her nervous glance at a small notepad. "Ah, right. Yes, here it is. Table number 12. Please, follow me. This way." Alexander felt irritation simmer in his chest, like steam building in a pressure cooker. The way this woman butchered standard English was almost offensive to his refined ears. As he followed her to his table, he observed her moving with a natural grace that completely contrasted with her apparent verbal clumsiness. "Could you bring me the wine list?" he asked, once seated, not bothering to thank her for seating him. "Of course, we have, very good wines. I will bring the list right away." Alexander's patience snapped. His features hardened as he clenched his fists on the table. "Excuse me, young lady, but could you please make an effort to speak proper English? I'm paying for a quality experience, not to listen to this." Eleanor Vance felt a blush creep up her neck, staining her cheeks a deep crimson. Her fingers tightened around the notepad in her hands, but she maintained her professional smile, though it now trembled slightly at the corners of her lips. "I apologize, sir. I am doing my best. I will bring the wine list." "Your best is clearly not good enough," Alexander retorted, raising his voice just enough for nearby tables to turn. "In a restaurant of this caliber, one would expect staff who can communicate civilly. Where did you learn to speak English? In your grandparents' shack?" The silence that followed was deafening. Diners at neighboring tables paused their conversations. Cutlery hung suspended in the air, and even the sounds from the kitchen seemed to dim. Eleanor felt as if the floor had opened beneath her, but something inside her hardened like steel. "Sir, I was born here, in Cornwall. This is my home, and Cornish is my first language. I speak English, French, and German, but Cornish is the language of my heart," she replied with a dignity that made several diners nod in approval. Alexander stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed through the dining room. "Exactly my point. If you can't speak decent English, you shouldn't be working in service. I want to speak to the manager. Now." Eleanor's green eyes shone with a mix of hurt and something more. Something Alexander couldn't identify at the moment, but would later recognize as deep wisdom and strength born from generations of cultural survival. "Of course, sir. I will call the manager immediately." As Eleanor walked away with measured steps and her head held high, Alexander couldn't help but notice the natural elegance of her stride, as if she carried in her veins the grace of women who for centuries had navigated the rough waters of the Celtic Sea alongside their men. But his arrogance was stronger than any aesthetic observation. He sat down again, satisfied with himself, adjusting the cuffs of his silk shirt as he waited for the manager to arrive so he could formally complain. However, something in the gaze of the other diners made him uncomfortable. It wasn't admiration he saw in their eyes, but a mix of disapproval and something that looked like pity. The murmur of conversations that gradually resumed in the dining room had a different tone now, as if a cold wind had swept through the restaurant. Alexander ignored the looks and focused on checking his phone, reviewing emails and stock quotes, while waiting for the manager to appear and resolve this staffing issue. What he didn't know was that in a few minutes, his entire world was about to be turned upside down, forever changing his perspective on power, respect, and the true value of people. The sound of firm footsteps approached from the kitchen, but Alexander didn't look up from his phone until a male voice addressed him in impeccable English, though tinged with a slight Cornish accent. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling. I'm Michael Davies, the front-of-house manager. I understand you have a complaint about our service." Alexander looked up to find a middle-aged man, robust and serious-faced, dressed in an elegant dark suit. His gray eyes observed him with a mix of professionalism and something that seemed like contained amusement. "Indeed," Alexander replied, straightening in his chair. "Your waitress is completely incompetent. She can't articulate a sentence in English without mixing in words from that regional language. It's embarrassing for an establishment of this caliber." Michael nodded slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "I understand your concern, Mr. Sterling. Could you describe specifically what bothered you?" "Everything!" Alexander exclaimed, gesticulating with his hands. "Her manner of speaking, her provincial accent, the fact that she clearly didn't receive a proper education in English. Places like this should hire staff who can at least communicate civilly." "I see," Michael murmured, and Alexander detected an almost imperceptible smile at the corners of his lips. "Allow me to ask you something, sir. Mr. Sterling, do you speak any language besides English?" The question took Alexander by surprise. "French, of course. And some German. What does that have to do with anything?" "Simple curiosity. And could you communicate perfectly in French, with an English accent, and perhaps mixing in some English words?" Alexander frowned. "That's completely different. French is an international language. We are in England, so English should be spoken correctly." At that moment, Eleanor reappeared, but something had changed in her posture. She walked with a confidence she hadn't shown before, and her green eyes held a different sparkle. She approached Michael directly and spoke to him in a low voice in Cornish. "Michael, let me handle this. I've got it." Alexander didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably authoritative. What surprised him most was Michael's reaction. He straightened immediately and nodded respectfully, like an employee receiving orders from their superior. "Of course, Madam Director," Michael replied, and Alexander noticed he used a term that sounded formal, almost reverential. Eleanor turned to Alexander, and in her eyes, there was no longer any trace of shyness or insecurity. "Mr. Sterling, I apologize that you had an unpleasant experience at our restaurant." "Our?" Alexander asked, confused by the change in pronoun. A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face, completely transforming her features. She no longer seemed like a nervous waitress, but a self-assured woman, with a presence that filled the space around her. "Allow me to introduce myself properly. I am Eleanor Vance. owner of the Harbor's Edge chain of restaurants. This is my company, Mr. Sterling." Alexander's world stopped. The words crashed into his consciousness like waves against the cliffs of Land's End during a storm. His face visibly paled, and his mouth opened without emitting a sound. "I occasionally work as a waitress in my restaurants," Eleanor continued, her voice now firm and clear, every English word pronounced with perfect precision. "It helps me get to know my employees better, and to assess the true character of our clients." Alexander felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. The blood drained from his face as he processed the magnitude of his mistake. He knew the Harbor's Edge chain. They were the most prestigious Cornish restaurants in the southwest of England, with an impeccable reputation and a clientele that included politicians, entrepreneurs, and celebrities. "No, it can't be," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "I was born in Land's End, into a family of fishermen," Eleanor continued, ignoring his shock. "I grew up speaking Cornish at home and learned English at school. I studied business administration at the University of Exeter. I have a master's in hospitality management from Cornell University in New York, and I speak 5 languages fluently." Each word was like a dagger to Alexander's pride. He noticed that several diners were watching them with interest, some openly smiling as the situation unfolded. "My provincial accent, as you called it, is the accent of a culture that has more than 7,000 years of history. Cornish is one of the oldest languages in Western Europe, Mr. Sterling. It survived the Romans, the Saxons, the Normans, and yes, it also survived those who tried to suppress it during past centuries." The silence in the restaurant was now complete. Alexander could hear the pounding of his own heart as Eleanor continued, her voice carrying the weight of generations of resistance and cultural pride. "What you witnessed tonight was an act. I wanted to see how you would react to someone you considered inferior, and I must say, your prejudices exceeded my worst expectations." Alexander tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The humiliation he felt was crushing, but what tormented him most was the realization that he had shown the worst of himself to a woman who clearly surpassed him in education, business success, and above all, in class and dignity. "Michael," Eleanor said, without taking her eyes off Alexander, "please prepare Mr. Sterling's bill. I believe he would prefer to dine elsewhere tonight." But how could Alexander simply leave after such a revelation? His world of certainties had just collapsed, and something within him refused to accept that this was the end of the story. Alexander remained motionless in his chair, as if the weight of the revelation had turned him to stone. His mind, accustomed to processing multi-million-dollar business decisions in seconds, had gone completely blank. The murmurs of approval from nearby diners reached his ears like the distant echo of a nightmare. I didn't want to know," he finally managed to articulate, his voice sounding strange even to himself. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying his face with the same attention she might devote to a financial statement. "Didn't know what? Exactly, Mr. Sterling. Didn't know that Cornish people can also be successful entrepreneurs? Didn't know that respect is earned, not bought? Or simply didn't know that your prejudices could have consequences?" Each question was like a hammer striking the anvil of his conscience. Alexander felt a cold sweat run down his back, soaking the silk of his designer shirt. His hands trembled slightly when he tried to take the glass of water in front of him. "Ms. Vance," he began, forcing his voice to sound firmer, "I accept that I made an error in judgment." "An error in judgment?" Eleanor's laugh held no humor. "Mr. Sterling, you didn't make a mistake. You revealed exactly who you are when you think no one is watching. You showed your true character." Michael approached discreetly and placed the bill on the table. Alexander looked at it without really seeing it, his mind still struggling to process what had happened. His entire belief system, everything he considered normal and natural, had crumbled in less than 10 minutes. "Do you know what hurts me the most?" Eleanor continued, her voice now softer, but no less penetrating. "It's not the personal offense. I've endured worse comments from men like you. What hurts me is thinking about my father, who broke his back for 40 years on fishing boats so I could study. What hurts me is thinking about my grandmother, who taught me that the Cornish language was a treasure we had to preserve." Eleanor's eyes moistened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "They taught me that education and respect go hand in hand. Apparently, that wasn't a lesson you learned in your private schools in London." Alexander felt as if an abyss had opened in his chest. For the first time in his adult life, he faced the real consequences of his arrogance, and the weight was almost unbearable. He looked around and saw that some diners were watching him with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. "Could I speak with you in private?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Eleanor observed him for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. "I don't think we have anything more to discuss, Mr. Sterling. You've made your opinion very clear about my culture and my people." "Please," Alexander insisted, and for the first time in years, the word "please" left his lips without calculation or manipulation, but as a genuine plea. "Just 5 minutes." Something in his tone made Eleanor hesitate. She saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a real vulnerability, a crack in the armor of arrogance he had shown all night. "Very well," she finally said. 5 minutes in my office." She walked towards the back of the restaurant, and Alexander followed her with uncertain steps. They passed through a bustling kitchen, where chefs worked with military precision. They climbed wooden stairs that creaked softly under their feet, and arrived at an oak door with a small plaque that read "Management." Eleanor's office was surprisingly modest. The walls were covered with family photographs, fishermen with their nets, Cornish women in traditional attire, and what appeared to be multiple generations of the Vance family. A simple but elegant desk occupied the center of the room, and the window overlooked the old town of Truro. 5 minutes, Eleanor repeated, crossing her arms as she leaned against her desk. Alexander stood in the center of the room, feeling smaller than he ever had. "I don't know how to start," he admitted. "A sincere apology would be a good start," Eleanor suggested, her voice less hostile, but still guarded. "You're right, more than right." Alexander took a deep breath. "What I did was unforgivable. My comments were those of an arrogant ignoramus who believes his way of seeing the world is the only valid one." Eleanor didn't respond, but Alexander noticed her posture relax slightly. "I grew up believing that London was the center of the universe, that English was superior to any other language, that—" He stopped, struggling with concepts he had never questioned. "That people like me were naturally superior to people like I thought you were." "And now?" Eleanor asked. Her voice neutral. "Now I realize I've been an idiot my entire life." For the first time since the revelation, Eleanor smiled slightly, though the smile didn't reach her eyes. "The first step to solving a problem is admitting it exists." Alexander nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and terror. Relief because she hadn't immediately thrown him out. Terror because he realized his worldview needed a complete overhaul. "Is there any way I can make amends for what I did?" he asked, aware of how pathetic he sounded. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "The 5 minutes are over, Mr. Sterling." Alexander felt the rejection like a punch to the stomach, but he nodded and headed for the door. However, before he could touch the doorknob, Eleanor's voice stopped him. "If you really want to make amends for what you did, you'll have to do more than offer money or empty apologies." He turned, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. What would I have to do? Eleanor's green eyes shone with something that could have been defiance or curiosity. You would have to be willing to question everything you think you know about the world. The Cornish night enveloped Alexander as he wandered aimlessly through the cobbled streets of the old town. His footsteps echoed against the stones, damp from the characteristic drizzle of Cornwall, a sound that seemed to mirror the turbulence in his mind. The lights of the pubs and restaurants cast golden reflections in the puddles, but he saw none of the beauty around him. He had returned to his five-star hotel in the center of Truro, but the luxury of his presidential suite felt empty and cold. The Egyptian cotton sheets, the fully stocked minibar, the panoramic views of the city, none of it could wash away the bitter taste of humiliation that still lingered in his mouth. He stopped in front of the window of a small bookstore that remained lit despite the late hour. Among the displayed books, he saw several titles in Cornish, a language he had, until that night, considered a folkloric curiosity of no real importance. Now the letters seemed like hieroglyphs from a civilization he had completely underestimated. "Mr. Sterling," the voice startled him. He turned to find Eleanor, now dressed in dark jeans and a cream wool sweater, her hair loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. Without the restaurant uniform, she looked younger, but also somehow more formidable. "Ms. Vance," he replied, feeling like a schoolboy caught misbehaving again. "What are you doing here so late?" "I live nearby," she simply replied. "I saw your figure from my window and curiosity, I suppose." Her eyes studied his face under the yellowish light of the street lamp. "You look like someone who has seen a ghost." Alexander tried to smile, but the gesture felt forced. "Perhaps I've seen something worse. Perhaps I've seen myself for the first time." Eleanor tilted her head, evaluating him. "Are you drunk, Mr. Sterling?" "Completely sober," he replied, and the irony was not lost on him. "Perhaps that's the problem. For the first time in years, I see things with a clarity I don't like at all." They stood in silence for a few moments, the sound of the light rain creating a melancholic soundtrack for the encounter. Eleanor seemed to be making a decision, her green eyes reflecting the streetlights as she watched him. "Have you had dinner?" she finally asked. The question took him by surprise. "No. After what happened, I had no appetite." "I know a place," she said, starting to walk. "Nothing fancy, just honest food." Alexander followed her, confused but intrigued. "Why are you doing this?" "Because my grandmother taught me that even enemies deserve a chance at redemption," she replied without turning. "And because there's something about you that tells me you're not really the man you showed tonight." They arrived at a small tapas bar hidden on a side street. The place was the exact opposite of the restaurants where Alexander normally dined. Worn wooden tables, mismatched chairs, walls decorated with old photographs and Cornish flags. The aroma of chorizo and Spanish tortilla filled the air. "Hello, Eleanor," shouted the man behind the bar, a robust Cornishman with a gray mustache. "How's our favorite businesswoman?" "I'm well, Patty. Bring 2 beers and some of your best tapas," Eleanor replied in Cornish, before translating for Alexander. "I told him we're good, and to bring us beer and tapas." They sat at a table near the window. Alexander watched as Eleanor interacted naturally with the bar owner, joking in Cornish and English, completely in her element. It was like watching a movie with subtitles, understanding only half of what was happening. "Why did you bring me here?" he asked when Patty walked away to prepare their order. "Because this place represents something you need to understand," Eleanor replied, leaning back in her chair. "Patty opened this bar 30 years ago. His father was a fisherman, just like mine. He doesn't speak French. His English has an accent, and he probably wouldn't know a fine wine from a cheap one, but he's one of the wisest men I know." "Wise in what sense?" "He knows the name of every regular customer, remembers their children's birthdays. When someone is going through financial difficulties, he forgets to charge them for a few beers. During the pandemic, he cooked free meals for healthcare workers. Eleanor paused as Patty arrived with 2 frothy beers. Doesn't that seem like a more valuable form of wisdom than knowing how to conjugate verbs correctly? Alexander took a sip of his beer, surprised by how refreshing it tasted. I suppose I'd never thought of it that way. That's exactly the point, Eleanor replied. You judge people by criteria that, at the end of the day, have nothing to do with their real value as human beings. Patty returned with a tray full of tapas, golden Spanish tortilla, steaming croquettes, hand-sliced Iberian ham, and something Alexander didn't recognize, but which looked delicious. This is Cornish black pudding with local peppers, Eleanor explained, noticing his confused expression. Try it. Alexander took a bite and was surprised by the explosion of flavors. It's incredible. The recipe has been passed down through 3 generations in Patty's family. You won't find it in any Michelin-starred restaurant, but it's authentic, it's real. As they ate, Eleanor began to tell him stories about Truro, about the city's transformation from a gray industrial center to a vibrant cultural metropolis. She told him about the Tate St. Ives, of course, but also about lesser-known places, small art galleries, traditional markets, hidden corners where Cornish history still lived and breathed. Do you know what Truro means in Cornish? She asked. Alexander shook his head. Tre Rú, 2 rivers. The city grew on the 2 banks of the river, connected but distinct. She smiled. Perhaps it's an appropriate metaphor for this conversation. For the first time since the disaster at the restaurant, Alexander felt relaxed. There was something in Eleanor's way of speaking, in her genuine passion for her culture and her city, that both calmed and intrigued him. Why are you doing this? He asked again. After what I said to you, you'd have every right to hate me. Eleanor studied him over her beer. Because I believe people can change. And why? Because I see something in you that perhaps even you haven't seen yet. What do you see? That's something you'll have to discover for yourself. The answer frustrated and excited him at the same time. When they said goodbye that night, Alexander felt that something fundamental had changed within him, though he couldn't identify exactly what. But one thing was clear. His story with Eleanor Vance was far from over. The next day, Alexander woke with a strange sensation in his chest, as if he had been breathing stale air for days, and fresh air had finally entered his lungs. The sunbeams filtering through the curtains of his suite didn't feel like any other morning in any other luxury hotel. There was something different in the quality of the light, in the sound of the city waking below. He dressed with more care than usual, but not with the military precision he normally employed to impress at business meetings. This time, there was something more personal in his choice. A light blue shirt without a tie, fabric trousers, instead of his usual armored suit. He looked in the mirror and didn't fully recognize the man looking back at him. He had made a decision during his sleepless night. He wasn't going back to London as if nothing had happened. He couldn't. Something had broken in him the night before, but perhaps, with luck, something better could grow in its place. He walked through the streets of Truro with a completely new perspective. The Cornish plaques that had once irritated him now sparked curiosity. The sounds of the Cornish language he heard in fragmented conversations no longer seemed like noise, but music, with a rhythm he didn't understand, but wanted to learn. He stopped in front of a small bookstore and, after several minutes of hesitation, went in. "Good morning," greeted the shop assistant, an older woman with reading glasses hanging from a silver chain. "Good morning. I'm looking for something about Cornish culture, for beginners," he said, feeling a blush on his cheeks. The woman smiled warmly. "Are you a tourist?" "Something like that," Alexander replied. I'm from London, and I've realized I know practically nothing about Cornwall. How wonderful that you want to learn. The woman headed towards a specific section of the store. I have just what you need. He left the bookstore with a bag full of books, a basic history of Cornwall, a Cornish English dictionary, a traditional Cornish cookbook, and something that had particularly intrigued him, a collection of illustrated Cornish legends. His next stop was less planned. Passing through a small square, he saw a group of children playing what appeared to be a version of football, but with rules he didn't recognize. An old man sitting on a bench watched the game with a smile. "Excuse me," Alexander approached. "Could you tell me what they're playing?" The old man looked at him with curiosity. "That's hurling, a traditional Cornish game, like football, but you can use your hands to pass the ball, not to score. Could you explain the rules?" For the next half hour, Alexander received an impromptu lesson on traditional Cornish sports. The old man, who introduced himself as Barnaby, turned out to be a former hurling player and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the region's sporting culture. "Where are you from?" Barnaby finally asked. "London," Alexander replied, bracing for the typical reaction. "Ah, a townie," Barnaby said, but his tone was affectionate, not derogatory. "What brings you to Cornwall?" "Business originally," Alexander replied, "but I've realized there's a lot to learn here." "There always is, son, there always is." The rest of the day passed in a haze of discoveries. Alexander visited the Truro Farmers Market, where vendors explained the difference between different types of fish from the Celtic Sea. He ate at a local pub, where he learned the traditional ritual of pouring cider. He even ventured into a church where a choir was rehearsing songs in Cornish, and he stood in the back, mesmerized by the beauty of the sounds. But in the back of his mind, all day long, was Eleanor. The image of her green eyes, the way she had spoken of her culture with such pride and passion, the way she had seen something in him worth saving. As the sun began to set, he found himself back in the neighborhood of the Harbor's Edge restaurant. He hadn't consciously planned to go there, but his feet had led him back, as if he had unfinished business. He sat on a bench opposite the restaurant, watching the comings and goings of diners. Some came out laughing, clearly satisfied with their experience. Others entered with expectation shining in their eyes. It was an urban ballet he had completely missed the night before, too focused on his own importance. "Waiting for someone?" The voice made him turn. Eleanor was standing a few feet away, dressed in an elegant black coat, her bag hanging from her shoulder. Her eyes showed surprise, but not hostility. "Not exactly," Alexander replied, standing up. "Just thinking." "About what?" Alexander held up the bag of books. "About everything I don't know." Eleanor approached and looked at the contents of the bag. Her expression gradually changed from surprise to something that might have been nascent respect. "Cornish mythology," she read aloud the title of one of the books. "A good choice." "Can you pronounce it?" "Cornish mythology," Alexander attempted, completely butchering the pronunciation. Eleanor laughed, and this time the laugh was genuine, without malice. "Curnow. The K is important." "Curnow," he repeated, and although still incorrect, it was closer. "Better," Eleanor said. "What inspired you to buy this?" "You," Alexander replied without hesitation. "What you said last night about questioning everything I think I know. I decided to start with the basics." Eleanor studied him for a moment, and Alexander had the feeling of being evaluated in some fundamental way. "Do you have plans for dinner?" she finally asked. "No. There's a place I'd like to show you, but this time, you're coming as my guest, not my client." The difference in tone, the way she said it, made Alexander feel something akin to hope blooming in his chest. "I'd love to," he replied. As they walked together through the streets of Truro, Alexander realized that he was embarking on a journey that went far beyond cultural tourism. He was beginning to become a different person, and for the first time in his life, that transformation didn't scare him. It gave him hope. The restaurant where Eleanor took him wasn't in any tourist guide. Tucked away on a narrow street near the river, the Fisherman's Rest was the kind of place where retired sailors gathered to reminisce about the sea while drinking local cider and playing cards. The walls were decorated with authentic fishing nets, black and white photographs of fishing boats, and the golden patina that only decades of conversation and tobacco smoke can provide. "My father used to bring me here when I was a little girl," Eleanor explained as they sat at a table by the window overlooking the river. "After his fishing trips, he'd come straight here to meet his friends. I'd sit in that corner," she pointed to a small table, "and listen to their stories." Alexander followed her gaze, imagining a young Eleanor absorbing the tales of men weathered by the sea and wind. What kind of stories? Everything. Storms that almost sank them. Miraculous catches when it seemed there were no fish in the entire Celtic Sea. Whale sightings. Eleanor's eyes lit up with the memory. But what fascinated me most were the stories about people. How they helped each other at sea. How they shared information about the best fishing spots. How a boat in trouble could always count on others to come to its aid. An older man approached their table, his face wrinkled by years of sea wind, but his eyes shining with genuine joy at seeing Eleanor. "Eleanor, my dear," he exclaimed, using what was obviously an affectionate term. "How's our girl?" "Hello, Joss," Eleanor replied, standing up to hug him. "I want to introduce you to Alexander. Alexander, this is Joss. He sailed with my father for 20 years. Joss extended a calloused hand to Alexander, studying him with the direct gaze of someone accustomed to judging character quickly. "Where are you from, lad?" "London," Alexander replied, bracing for the usual reaction. But Joss simply nodded. "Big city. Very different from the sea." "Very different," Alexander agreed. "Joss tells the best stories from all along the coast," Eleanor told Alexander. "If you have time, maybe he'll tell us one." Joss's eyes lit up. He clearly didn't need much persuasion to share his tales. He sat in an empty chair and began to speak in a mixture of English and Cornish, automatically translating when he saw Alexander's confused expression. "It was the winter of '78, he began, "and we hadn't seen land for 3 days because of the fog. The sea was, how to say, like a furious animal. 30-foot waves, wind that snatched the words from your mouth before you could speak them." Alexander found himself leaning forward, captivated by Joss's narration. The man had a gift for making his listeners feel the spray of salt water on their faces, the rocking of the boat beneath their feet. Then we saw a light, a boat in trouble about 2 miles away. We couldn't see what flag it was flying, whether they were Cornish, Welsh, or even French. But that didn't matter. At sea, there are only 2 kinds of people, those in trouble and those who can help. "What did you do?" Alexander asked, completely absorbed in the story. "What you always do. We went to them. It turned out their engine had failed, and they were drifting towards the cliffs. They were fishermen from Plymouth. We'd never seen them before. We'd probably never see them again. But for the next 6 hours, they were our brothers." Joss paused to take a sip of his drink. "We towed them to safe harbor. When we got to Falmouth, the captain of the Plymouth boat wanted to pay us. My captain, Eleanor's father, told him, 'The next time you see a Cornish boat in trouble, do the same. That's all the payment we need.'" Alexander felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he couldn't fully identify. "And did he? The man from Plymouth?" 5 years later, Joss continued with a smile. "Our boat had trouble with the net near Plymouth. Guess who showed up to help us? The same man, and his 2 sons, who were already working with him. They helped us repair the net, invited us to dinner, and gave us information about the best fishing spots in the area. Joss looked directly at Alexander. That's the Cornish way, lad. It doesn't matter where you come from or how you speak. What matters is what you do when someone needs help. After Joss said goodbye to join other friends, Alexander and Eleanor remained silent for several minutes, contemplating the lights reflecting on the dark water of the river. "Do you understand now why what you said last night hurt me so much?" Eleanor finally asked. Alexander nodded slowly. "I wasn't just judging your way of speaking. I was judging an entire way of seeing the world, a way of seeing the world based on solidarity, on mutual respect, on the idea that we are all stronger when we take care of each other." Eleanor turned her glass in her hands. "My father used to say that the sea doesn't discriminate. Storms hit everyone equally, regardless of their accent or their education. The only thing that matters is whether you're willing to lend a hand when someone needs it." "And I failed that test completely," Alexander murmured. "Last night, yes," Eleanor agreed. "But you're here trying to learn, and that counts for something." Alexander looked at her, seeing not only the beauty in her features, but the depth of character that shone in her eyes. "Why are you giving me this opportunity? After what I did, it would be easier to simply dismiss me as just another arrogant businessman." Eleanor smiled, and this time, the smile reached her eyes completely. "Because my grandmother taught me something Joss just demonstrated. Sometimes, people who seem lost just need someone to show them the way home. And what if I never had a home to go back to? Then," Eleanor said, raising her glass in a toast, "perhaps it's time for you to build a new one." As they clinked glasses, Alexander felt he was doing more than a social gesture. He was committing to a journey he didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in years, it genuinely excited him. Are you starting to see the transformation? What do you think Alexander will do next? Share your predictions in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story, make sure you've subscribed and hit the like button. The following days took on a rhythm Alexander had never experienced. Instead of business meetings that normally filled every hour of his schedule, his days began to be structured around small discoveries and meaningful conversations. He had indefinitely postponed his return to London, something that had made his personal assistant call him 3 times to confirm he hadn't suffered a nervous breakdown. Eleanor had begun to show him Truro from a completely different perspective. Not the obvious tourist sites, although they eventually visited the Tate St. Ives and marveled together at the sculptures, but the places where the true heart of the city beat. One morning, she took him to the Truro farmers market early, when vendors were just setting up their stalls. "I want you to meet Betty," she told him, heading towards a fish stall where a robust woman in a white apron cleaned fish with precise, expert movements. "Betty, this is Alexander, the townie I told you about," Eleanor said in English, though she interspersed a few phrases in Cornish that Alexander didn't understand, but clearly amused both women. "So you're the one who insulted our," Betty said, but her tone was more curious than hostile. "Looks like you've learned since then." "I'm trying," Alexander replied honestly. Betty studied him as she continued her work, her hands moving automatically, while her eyes evaluated his character. "Do you know how to tell a fresh sea bream from one that's been out of water for 2 days?" "I have no idea," Alexander admitted. "Look at the eyes," Betty explained, holding up a silvery fish. "When they're clear and bright, like these, the fish is fresh. When they look cloudy or sunken, better find somewhere else to eat." For the next hour, Alexander received a practical education in seafood, fish, and products from the Celtic Sea that he couldn't have gotten in any culinary school. Betty taught him to recognize the best razor clams, to distinguish between different types of anchovies, and the crucial difference between Cornish and Scottish mussels. "It's like getting to know people," Betty explained as she wrapped a selection of fresh fish for Eleanor. At first, everything seems the same, but when you learn to really look, each one has its own personality, its own story to tell. As they walked away from the market, Alexander reflected on Betty's words. Is that what I'm doing? Learning to really look? What do you think? Eleanor asked, adjusting her coat against the cool breeze coming from the river. I think I've spent my whole life looking without really seeing, Alexander replied, as if I'd been wearing glasses with the wrong prescription. That afternoon, Eleanor took him to meet her family. The Vance family home was in Land's End, a traditional stone building that had housed 3 generations of the family. When Eleanor opened the door, the aroma of homemade stew immediately filled the air. "Grandma, we're here!" Eleanor called into the house. An older woman appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron decorated with Cornish motifs. Her eyes, the same intense green as Eleanor's, studied Alexander with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Grandma, this is Alexander. Alexander, my grandma, Mary." "Hello," Mary said. And then, in careful but clear English, "Welcome to our home." During dinner, a hake stew that was possibly the most delicious thing Alexander had ever tasted, Mary began to tell him stories about the family's history. Through the photographs that covered the living room walls, Alexander got to know generations of Vances. Fishermen, merchants, a great-grandmother who had been a teacher during the early 20th century, a great-uncle who had been a professional wrestler. "My husband, Eleanor's father, always said that families are like trees," Mary explained, her hands gesticulating as she spoke. "The roots are important because they give you strength and tell you where you come from. But the branches are just as important because they grow towards the future." "What happened to him?" Alexander asked softly. "The sea took him 10 years ago," Mary replied with a sadness she had learned to carry with dignity. "An unexpected storm. But before he left, he saw Eleanor graduate from university. He saw her begin to build her business. He died knowing that the branches of his tree would grow strong." Alexander looked at Eleanor, seeing a new dimension of strength in her. She had lost her father. She had had to bear the expectations of a family business, and yet she had maintained her grace and compassion. "How did you do it?" he asked, addressing Eleanor. "How did you keep going after losing someone so important?" "Because he taught me that pain is the price we pay for love," Eleanor replied, "and that it's better to have loved and lost than never to have had those roots that give you strength." That night, as they walked back towards the center of Truro, Alexander felt something fundamentally changing in his understanding of the world. All his life he had pursued success, recognition, the accumulation of wealth and power. But here, he had found something completely different. A richness measured in relationships, in shared stories, in the depth of human connections. "Eleanor," he said suddenly, stopping under a street lamp. "Yes? I want to apologize again, but this time not just for what I said in the restaurant. I want to apologize for having lived 35 years without truly understanding what it means to be human." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've changed something in me that I didn't know needed changing. You've shown me that there's a completely different way to be in the world." "And how does that feel?" Alexander reflected for a moment. "Terrifying and exciting at the same time, as if I had lived my whole life in a small room, and suddenly someone had shown me there was a door leading to a huge world." Eleanor smiled, and in that smile, Alexander saw something that made him feel as if he were standing on the edge of a beautiful and dangerous precipice. "Then, perhaps," she said softly, "it's time for you to cross that door." The sound of rain against the windows of the cafe where they had taken shelter created a perfect soundtrack for the intimate conversation unfolding between Alexander and Eleanor. They had been walking through the university district when they were caught in a typical northern downpour, and had rushed into the first place they found. A small university cafe full of students studying, couples whispering, and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. "What now?" Eleanor murmured, looking out the steamy window. "What did you say?" Alexander asked, wiping his damp hair with a paper napkin. "I said, 'What now?' in Cornish," Eleanor explained, smiling at his confused expression. "It's automatic when it rains. My grandmother always said that when the weather suddenly changed." "Teach me," Alexander said, impulsively. "What?" "Teach me to say something in Cornish, something basic." Eleanor tilted her head, studying him. "Are you sure? It's a difficult language for English speakers." "I'm sure." "Very well. Let's start with something simple. Deed da means hello. Can you repeat it?" "Deed da," Alexander attempted, but the pronunciation sounded forced and strange in his mouth. No, listen. Deed da. The DH is like the th in this. Deed da," she repeated, and this time it sounded marginally better. "Better. Now, Murras, thank you." For the next half hour, Eleanor taught him basic phrases in Cornish. Alexander struggled with the pronunciation, got frustrated with the seemingly illogical structure of the language, and marveled at how Eleanor could switch so fluidly between Cornish and English. "It's like you're two different people," he observed, after hearing her speak on the phone with someone in Cornish. Her intonation had changed. Her body language had become more expressive. "When you speak Cornish, you seem, I don't know how to explain it, more yourself." "It's because I am," Eleanor replied simply. "Cornish is the language in which I learned to love, to laugh, to cry. It's the language in which my father sang me lullabies, in which my grandmother told me stories. When I speak Cornish, I'm connected to something that goes beyond words." "How is it possible for a language to contain so much?" "Because a language isn't just words, Alexander. It's a way of seeing the world, of organizing thoughts, of expressing emotions that perhaps don't exist in the same way in other languages." Eleanor took a sip of her coffee. "For example, in Cornish, we have a word, hiraeth, which means something like longing, but it's more specific. It's the longing you feel for a place you love when you're far from it. And that emotion doesn't exist in English. The emotion exists, but we don't have a word that captures it exactly. So, when we lose a language, we don't just lose words. We lose ways of feeling, of thinking, of existing." Alexander fell silent, processing this. That's why what I said hurt so much." "Exactly. You weren't just criticizing my pronunciation. You were denying the value of an entire way of being human." The rain had stopped, but neither of them moved to leave. The conversation had taken on a depth that made the outside world seem less important than the intimate space they had created at that cafe table. "Can I ask you something personal?" Alexander said. "You can ask. I don't promise to answer. Why did you decide to pretend to be just a waitress that night? Did you really just want to test the character of the clients?" Eleanor toyed with her coffee cup for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes I get tired of being the successful businesswoman. Sometimes I want to remember where I come from, who I was before I had responsibilities and employees and bank accounts. When I work as a waitress, I'm just Eleanor, not the heiress of the family business. Not the woman who appears in business magazine articles, just me." "And what did you discover about me that night?" "That you were exactly what I expected you to be," she replied honestly. "Another arrogant executive who believes his money gives him the right to belittle others." "And now?" Eleanor looked him directly in the eyes. "Now I think that perhaps that person was a mask you've worn for so long that you'd forgotten there was someone else underneath." "And who is that person?" "That's something you have to discover for yourself." A student at a nearby table began to play the guitar softly, and the melody filled the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Alexander watched Eleanor as she listened to the music, noticing how her expression softened, how her shoulders relaxed. "Do you know what's strangest about all this?" he finally said. "What?" "That for the first time in my life, I don't have a plan. I don't have clear goals, strategies, spreadsheets telling me what to do next, and instead of being scared, I feel free. Freedom can be terrifying when you're not used to it. Do you feel free?" Eleanor considered the question. "Sometimes, when I'm here, in Truro, surrounded by my family and my culture, I feel deeply connected. But I also carry the weight of expectations, of keeping a tradition alive, of being successful in a world that doesn't always value what I represent. And when you're with me?" The question came out before Alexander could censor it, and he felt exposed and vulnerable the moment the words left his lips. Eleanor looked at him in surprise, and then smiled slowly. "When I'm with you, I feel curious. Curious to see who you could become if you let go of everything you think you have to be." It was the most honest and terrifying answer Alexander had heard in years, and he knew in that moment that he was falling. Not just in love with Eleanor, but in love with the possibility of becoming someone completely different. The next morning dawned clear, one of those rare days in Truro when the sun seemed to have decided to stay and honor the city. Alexander had woken earlier than usual, not out of obligation, but from a strange energy that had awakened him with a sense of anticipation he couldn't fully identify. Eleanor had suggested they visit the Tate St. Ives together, but not as typical tourists. "I want to show you something specific," she had said mysteriously the day before. "Something I think you need to see." They met in the square in front of the museum, where Jeff Koons' puppy sculpture stood guard with its colorful flowers, creating a striking contrast with the titanium metallic curves of Frank Gehry's building. Alexander had seen the museum in photographs, of course, but being in front of it in person was completely different. "What do you think?" Eleanor asked, observing his reaction. "It's extraordinary," Alexander replied, slowly turning to take in the entire structure. "It's as if the building is alive, as if it moves even when it's still." "Exactly. When it was built, many locals opposed it. They said it was too modern, too strange for our traditional town. But look what happened." Alexander observed the constant flow of visitors, families taking photos, street artists who had set up their stalls nearby. Life buzzed around the museum in a way that seemed organic and natural. "It changed the whole town," he murmured. "It changed the whole region," Eleanor corrected. "But most importantly, it taught us something about change itself. Sometimes what seems impossible or inappropriate at first can transform into something beautiful if you give it a chance." They entered the museum, but instead of heading directly to the main galleries, Eleanor led him to a smaller room where a temporary installation by a contemporary Cornish artist was exhibited. The work consisted of a series of video projections showing faces of older people, speaking in Cornish, their words projected on the wall in letters that appeared and disappeared like waves. "What are they saying?" Alexander asked, fascinated by the visual poetry of the installation. "They are telling memories," Eleanor explained. The artist traveled all over Cornwall, interviewing older people, asking them to share their most cherished memories in Cornish. "Look at that woman there." Alexander followed her gaze to a projection where an elderly woman, with a face furrowed by wrinkles, smiled as she spoke. The Cornish words appeared and disappeared on the wall, but there were subtitles in English and French. "She's telling about the day she met her husband at a fair in St. Just," Eleanor translated. "She says he didn't know how to dance the furry dance, but he tried to learn just to impress her." They stayed there for almost an hour, absorbing the projected stories. There was a fisherman who remembered his first catch, a teacher who spoke about secretly teaching Cornish during difficult times, a local athlete who described the feeling of hitting the ball perfectly in a crowded stadium. "Why did you bring me here?" Alexander finally asked. "Because I wanted you to see that preserving culture doesn't mean being trapped in the past," Eleanor replied. "It means honoring what came before, while creating something new for the future." They moved to other galleries, where Alexander found himself seeing art with completely different eyes. An abstract sculpture by Barbara Hepworth, a Cornish artist, mesmerized him with the way it captured the movement of wind in solid bronze. Paintings by contemporary artists spoke to him of emotions he didn't know he had words for. "I've never really understood modern art," Alexander admitted, in front of a particularly abstract painting. "I always thought it was, pretentious or empty. And now? Now I think that perhaps I wasn't seeing with the right eyes." They left the museum as the sun began to set, walking slowly towards the river. The golden reflections on the water created a landscape that seemed painted, and Alexander found himself noticing details he would normally have overlooked. The way the light fragmented into ripples, the sound of seagulls mixing with urban traffic, the salty aroma carried by the wind from the sea. "Eleanor," he said suddenly, stopping on the promenade by the water. "Yes? I want to ask you something, but I don't know how to do it without sounding presumptuous." Eleanor turned to him, curiosity and caution mixing in her expression. "Ask. Do you think that we could be friends? Real friends, I mean. Not just tourist and local guide, but," he searched for the right words, "people who care about each other." The question hung in the air between them like a delicate butterfly. Eleanor studied him with those green eyes that seemed to see straight through all his defenses. "Why is it important to you?" she asked. "Because in the last few weeks with you, I've felt something I didn't know I was missing. A real connection with another person. And I'm afraid that when I leave Truro, I'll go back to being the person I was before." And what person was that? Someone who had everything money could buy and nothing that truly mattered. Eleanor took a step closer, and Alexander could see small golden flecks in her green eyes. "Real friendship requires total honesty. Are you ready for that? Ready?" "I think so." "And are you ready for me to challenge you when I see you falling into old patterns?" "Especially that." Eleanor extended her hand to him, and when Alexander took it, he felt as if he were signing a contract more important than any of the multi-million-dollar deals he had closed in his career. "Then yes," she said, "I think we could be friends." But as they walked hand in hand along the river, both knew that what was growing between them had already transcended friendship, becoming something deeper and more profound. The plot thickens. What do you think this something deeper and more dangerous could be? Leave your theories in the comments, and if you're hooked, don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing stories. "Hey, love." Alexander's phone had been ringing all morning, with the insistence of a fire alarm. Calls from his London office, WhatsApp messages from clients asking why he hadn't returned, emails marked urgent, piling up in his inbox like unpaid debts. He had been ignoring them for days, but the reality of his old life was beginning to seep into his Truro bubble like cold water into a leaky boat. He was sitting on a bench facing the river, contemplating the Tate St. Ives in the distance, when he finally decided to check his messages. The first was from Smith, his partner at the investment firm. "Alexander, where the hell are you? The Japanese are waiting for an answer on the Manchester project. If we don't close this week, we lose $50 million. The second was from his personal assistant. "Mr. Sterling, your mother called 3 times. She says if you don't call her today, she's going to hire a private detective to find you." The third, from an important client. "Sterling, I need you to review the contracts immediately. The competition is breathing down our necks." Each message was like a hook, pulling him back towards a life that, only a few weeks ago, had been his entire universe. But now, sitting by the water, watching Cornish families walk with their children, hearing fragments of Cornish mixing with the sound of seagulls, that life seemed to belong to another person. His phone rang again. This time, it was his mother. "Mom? Alexander, my God, where have you been? I've been calling you for a week. Your assistant says you're in Truro on business, but Smith says there's no business that justifies you being there for so long." Eleanor Sterling's voice had that tone of maternal concern, mixed with exasperation that he remembered from his childhood. "I'm fine, Mom. I just needed a break." "A break? Alexander, you don't take breaks. You didn't even stop when you had the flu last year. What's really going on?" Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of having to explain something he himself didn't yet fully understand. "It's complicated, Mom." "Then uncomplicate it. Come home and we'll talk." "I can't, not yet." The silence that followed was laden with all the unspoken expectations that had defined their relationship for decades. Eleanor Sterling had raised her son to be successful, to conquer the London business world, to be the perfect heir to a family that had built its fortune over generations. "Alexander," she finally said, her voice softer, "does this have to do with a woman?" The question took him by surprise. "Why do you ask that?" "Because it's the only thing that could make my son, who has planned every day of his life since he was 15, disappear without explanation in a city he doesn't know." Alexander laughed in spite of himself. His mother had always been too perceptive for her own good. "In part, yes, but it's more complicated than that." "Is it serious?" "I don't know. Maybe, probably." "And is she the reason you don't want to come back?" "She's the reason I'm discovering that the person I was in London might not be who I really want to be." Another silence, this one longer. "Alexander, I'm worried about you. This doesn't sound like you." "Perhaps that's exactly the point, Mom." After hanging up, Alexander sat contemplating the water, feeling as if he was being pulled in two directions by equally powerful forces. In one direction was everything he had built: his company, his reputation, his social status, the comfort of a predictable and successful life. In the other direction was, what? The possibility of something better? Or simply the romantic fantasy of a middle-aged man who had confused attraction with a spiritual revelation? His phone vibrated with a message from Eleanor. "Coffee this afternoon. I have something to show you." He looked at the message for a long moment before replying. "I need to talk to you about something important." They met at the same university cafe where they had had their Cornish lesson, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Alexander was tense, distracted, constantly checking his phone. Eleanor noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked directly, without preamble. "My real life is catching up to me," Alexander replied, showing her some of the emails and messages he had received. "I have responsibilities, commitments, people who depend on me." Eleanor read some of the messages in silence. "And what are you going to do?" "I don't know. That's the truth. For the first time in my life, I don't have a plan." "Do you want to go back?" The direct question forced him to confront something he had been avoiding. "Part of me does. It's easier. It's familiar. I know how to be that person." "And the other part?" "The other part is afraid that if I leave now, I'll never find the courage to truly change." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Do you know what I think?" "What?" "I think you can't run away from who you were, but you also can't pretend that these last few weeks haven't happened. You have to find a way to integrate both parts of yourself." "And how am I supposed to do that?" "That," Eleanor said, gently touching his hand across the table, "is the question only you can answer." But deep in his heart, Alexander knew that the answer depended on something he hadn't yet dared to ask her. if there was space in Eleanor's life for someone like him, not just as a temporary visitor, but as a permanent part of her world. The decision came in the most unexpected way. Alexander was in his hotel room, checking the accumulating emails for the umpteenth time, when his phone rang with a call that would change everything. "Mr. Sterling, it's Smith. I need you back in London immediately." "What happened?" "The Japanese pulled out of the project. They say our lack of seriousness in negotiations made them doubt our commitment. We lost the $50 million, and now other clients are asking questions." Alexander felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "When?" "This morning. I got the call an hour ago. Alexander, this is serious. We need to do damage control, and we need to do it now." After hanging up, Alexander sat on the bed, contemplating the consequences of his actions, or more precisely, of his lack of action. He had been so absorbed in his personal transformation that he had ignored the responsibilities he had to other people, employees, partners, clients who had trusted him. He dressed mechanically and left the hotel, walking aimlessly through the streets of Truro as he processed what had happened. The irony was not lost on him. In his quest to become a better person, he had hurt people who depended on him professionally. Unconsciously, his steps led him to the Harbor's Edge restaurant. It was mid-afternoon, and the place was relatively empty. He saw Eleanor through the window, working on her laptop at a corner table, reviewing what appeared to be financial documents. He entered and approached her table. When she looked up, she immediately noticed his expression. "What happened?" she asked, closing the laptop. Alexander told her everything. The call from Smith, the lost clients, the realization that his absence had had real consequences for real people. "I have to go back to London," he concluded. "Today?" "Yes." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Of course you do. But you don't want to leave." "I know. And you don't know when you'll be able to come back." "I know." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the situation settling between them like a thick fog. "Eleanor," Alexander finally said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "I always am." "Is there any possibility that this," he gestured between them, "is something more than a friendship? Something worth fighting to preserve?" The question he had been avoiding for weeks was finally in the air. Eleanor looked him directly in the eyes, and Alexander saw something he hadn't seen before: vulnerability. "What do you need to hear?" she asked. "I need to hear the truth." Eleanor took a deep breath. "The truth is, you scare me." "I scare you?" "I'm scared of what I feel when I'm with you. I'm scared of how fast it's happened. I'm scared that you're from a completely different world than mine." She paused. "And I'm scared to think that all this might just be a romantic fantasy that fades the moment you go back to your real life." "What if it's not a fantasy? What exactly are you asking, Alexander?" He knew he had reached the moment of truth. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to try and build something together. I don't know what it would look like. I don't know how it would work logistically, but I'm asking if it's worth trying." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "And what about your life in London? Your company?" "I don't know. Maybe I can find a way to divide my time. Maybe I can change the way I do business. Maybe." He stopped, realizing what he was about to say. "Maybe it's time for me to make more radical changes." "Are you saying you'd leave London, your company?" "I'm saying that maybe the life I've been building isn't the life I really want." "That's a very big decision to make for someone you've known for only a few weeks." "I'm not making it just for you," Alexander replied. "I'm making it for me, for the person I've discovered I can be when I'm here." Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, contemplating the damp street. "Alexander, I don't want to be the reason you destroy your life. And I don't want my old life to be the reason I lose the opportunity to build something better." She turned to him, and Alexander saw tears shining in her eyes. "What exactly are you asking me?" I'm asking you to wait for me. I'm asking you to give me the chance to fix the mess I made in London, and then come back here. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that this is real. And what if you can't fix the mess? And what if your life in London consumes you completely again? Then I will have lost the best opportunity of my life. Eleanor returned to the table and took Alexander's hands in hers. Okay, she said softly. I'll wait for you, but on one condition. What is it? That when you come back, if you come back, it's because you've truly decided who you want to be. Not because you're running from something, but because you're running towards something. I promise you. They kissed then, for the first time. And it was a kiss that tasted of possibilities and goodbyes, of promises and fear, of all that could be and all that could be lost. When they separated, both knew they had crossed a point of no return. Whatever the outcome, nothing would ever be the same. The express train to London had never seemed so long. Alexander gazed at the passing landscape, watching as the intense green of Cornwall gradually gave way to the drier tones of the English countryside, and he felt as if he were traveling not just through space, but back to an earlier version of himself. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. Smith had organized emergency meetings for that very afternoon. Clients wanted explanations. Employees were nervous. The entire business ecosystem he had built for years was trembling because its centerpiece had disappeared for a few weeks. When he arrived at his office in London's financial district, he felt like an actor returning to a familiar stage, but playing a role that no longer fit him. The glass and steel building, his office on the 15th floor with panoramic views of the Capitol, the mahogany desk that had cost more than most people's annual salary. Everything felt superficial, like an elaborate set for a play that had lost its meaning. Finally! Smith entered his office without knocking, something that would normally have irritated Alexander, but now simply seemed urgent. Where the hell have you been? And don't tell me it was work, because I've called all our contacts in the Southwest, and no one knows anything about any project. Alexander sat down slowly in his executive chair, which had once been his throne, but now felt like a comfortable prison. It's complicated. Uncomplicated, because while you were gone, the world didn't stop. The Japanese not only canceled the project, they're talking to Davies and Associates. Our most important clients are questioning our stability, and I have 3 employees who have come to ask me if they should start looking for other jobs. Each word was like a hammer striking his conscience. Alexander realized that his search for personal authenticity had had real consequences for people who trusted him. What do you need me to do? He asked. I need you to be the Alexander Sterling you've always been, the one who closes impossible deals, the one who reassures nervous clients, the one who makes things work. Smith approached the desk. I need you to forget any midlife crisis you're having and save this company. For the next 6 hours, Alexander immersed himself in work with an intensity he hadn't felt in weeks. He called clients, reorganized contracts, negotiated new terms, and little by little began to stabilize the situation. It was like riding a bicycle. The skills were there, yet automated by years of practice. But as he worked, a part of his mind remained in Truro. He thought of Eleanor reviewing her restaurant's books, of the stories Joss told about maritime solidarity, of the way Mary spoke about the roots and branches of family trees. At 10 p.m., when he finally left the office, he had managed to save the Japanese project, with less favorable terms, but saved nonetheless. He had reassured the most important clients and had assured his employees that the company was solid. But he felt empty, as if he had used muscles he had been resting, and now they ached. His apartment in Mayfair, which had once been his luxurious refuge, felt strangely sterile. The designer furniture, the carefully selected artworks, the windows overlooking one of London's most exclusive streets. Everything seemed to belong to another person. He poured himself a 30-year-old whiskey, a bottle he had been saving for a special occasion that had never arrived, and sat on his Italian leather sofa, looking at the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His phone vibrated with a message from Eleanor. How was the first day back in the real world? The question made him smile for the first time all day. He replied, like wearing shoes that no longer fit. Foot pain or soul pain? Both. Did you fix what you needed to fix? Alexander reflected on the question. Had he fixed the immediate problems, put out the fires, restored confidence? But had he really fixed anything? Or had he simply applied temporary bandages to deeper wounds? I fixed the symptoms, he wrote, but I think the real problem is more fundamental. What's the real problem? That was the question, wasn't it? Alexander looked out the window at the lights of London, at the city that had been his home, his entire adult life, and realized that the answer was something he had been avoiding confronting. The real problem, he wrote slowly, is that I've built a life that requires me to be someone I no longer want to be. Eleanor's reply came several minutes later. Then perhaps it's time to build a different life. It's that simple. I never said it was simple. I said it might be necessary. Alexander stayed awake late that night, contemplating for the first time in his life the possibility of systematically dismantling everything he had built so he could rebuild something completely different. It was terrifying and exciting at the same time, like standing on the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump without knowing exactly what lay below. But for the first time in years, he felt completely awake. 3 weeks later, Alexander had established a precarious but functional routine. Days of brutally efficient business decisions, interspersed with nights of long calls with Eleanor, where they shared details of their days, dreams for the future, and a growing intimacy that made the physical distance feel increasingly unbearable. The company was stabilized, clients reassured, but Alexander felt like an actor playing the role of his own former life. Every meeting, every successful negotiation, every moment of business triumph felt hollow, like winning a game whose rules no longer mattered to him. It was during one of these nights, while reviewing financial reports in his study, that he received a call that would change everything. Mr. Sterling, this is Dr. Miller from Royal Cornwall Hospital in Truro. Alexander's heart stopped. What happened? Is Eleanor okay? Mr. Sterling, I'm afraid I have bad news about Ms. Mary Vance. Eleanor's grandmother has suffered a heart attack and is in intensive care. Her condition is serious. Alexander's world reeled. Is Eleanor? She's here, at the hospital. She's been here since last night. She asked me to call you. I'm leaving for Truro immediately. Mr. Sterling, I must warn you that the situation is very delicate. It's possible that... I understand. I'll be there in 4 hours. Alexander hung up the phone and, for a moment, remained motionless, processing the information. Then, as if he had received an electric shock, he moved with a determination he hadn't felt in weeks. He called Smith. Cancel all my meetings for the next few days. It's a family emergency. What? Alexander, tomorrow we have the presentation for the German investors. You can't. Find a way to handle it without me. Alexander, you can't just disappear again. The company will survive. Alexander interrupted, surprised by the clarity in his own voice. Some things are more important. He hung up before Smith could reply, packed a small suitcase, and headed to the airport. During the flight to Truro, Alexander had time to reflect on what he had felt the moment he received that call. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't calculated business costs. He hadn't considered the consequences for his career. He had acted purely from the heart, and that clarity told him something important about what truly mattered in his life. He arrived at the hospital as the sun was setting over Truro, painting the sky with orange and pink hues that contrasted dramatically with the sterile white walls of the medical building. He found Eleanor in the intensive care waiting room, sitting alone on a plastic chair, her normally upright posture now hunched by the weight of worry. When Eleanor looked up and saw him approach, her eyes filled with tears. She stood up and ran to him, and Alexander enveloped her in his arms, feeling her tremble against his chest. "I came as soon as I could," he murmured against her hair. I didn't know if you could come," Eleanor replied, her voice choked with emotion. "Of course I came. How is your grandmother?" Eleanor pulled back slightly to look at him, and Alexander saw deep pain in her eyes, mixed with something that might have been gratitude. "She's stable for now, but the doctors say the next 24 hours are critical. She's 84. And her heart couldn't finish the sentence. Alexander hugged her tighter, aware that there was something deeply significant in the fact that she had asked the doctor to call him, that she had included him in this intimate and terrifying moment of her life. "Have you eaten anything?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head. "I can't." "Come," he said softly, taking her hand. "Let's get something. Your grandmother won't benefit if you get sick from exhaustion." He led her to the hospital cafeteria, where he managed to convince her to at least have a coffee and a sandwich. As they sat at the formica table under the fluorescent lights, Eleanor began to speak. "All morning I've been thinking about all the things I never told her," she murmured, distractedly tearing apart the sandwich without eating it. "All the times I was too busy with work to visit her, all the conversations I postponed for later." "Don't do that," Alexander said firmly. "Don't torture yourself with the what-ifs. Your grandmother knows you love her." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've seen the way you talk about her. I've seen the photos in her house. I've heard the stories you tell. Love isn't measured in the amount of time you spend with someone, but in the quality of that connection." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "When did you get so wise?" "When I started spending time with a woman who taught me that the most important things in life can't be measured on spreadsheets." They returned to the waiting room, where other arriving family members joined them. Eleanor's cousins, family friends, people who clearly formed part of the extensive network of relationships that supported the Vances. Alexander watched as they supported each other, how they shared memories of Mary, how they took turns being with Eleanor. It was the exact opposite of what he had experienced when his own father had died 5 years earlier. Then, Alexander had handled everything alone. The funeral arrangements, the legal aspects, the private grieving in his solitary apartment. He had seen death as another business problem to be solved efficiently. Here, pain was shared, processed communally, becoming something that united rather than isolated. Near midnight, Dr. Miller came out of intensive care with a cautiously optimistic expression. "Her condition has stabilized," he announced to the gathered family. "Her vital signs are stronger. I think she can receive very brief visits, one person at a time." Eleanor was the first to enter. Alexander watched her disappear behind the double doors of intensive care and felt an anxiety he had never experienced, as if the well-being of someone else had become more important than his own. When Eleanor returned 20 minutes later, she was crying, but her tears seemed more of relief than pain. "She's awake," she announced to everyone. "She's weak, but awake. And the first thing she asked me was if the London boy had come." All eyes turned to Alexander, who felt heat rising up his neck. "Was she referring to me?" "I told her about you," Eleanor admitted. "I told her about us." "And what does she think?" Eleanor smiled for the first time all day. "She says she wants to meet you." When Alexander entered the intensive care unit, he felt overwhelmed by the fragility of the human body. Mary looked tiny in the hospital bed, connected to multiple machines that monitored every heartbeat, every breath. But when she opened her eyes and saw him, the smile that appeared on her wrinkled face was radiant. "So you're the one who stole my Eleanor's heart," she said in careful but clear English. "Miss Vance," Alexander began, approaching the bed. "I don't know if—" "Call me Grandma," she interrupted. "And sit down, I don't have much time for formalities." Alexander sat in the chair by the bed, impressed by the vitality this woman radiated despite her condition. "Eleanor has told me a lot about you," Mary continued. "She says you're different now than you were when you arrived. I think your granddaughter changed my life." "No," Mary said firmly. "She didn't change you. She helped you find who you really were. That's the difference." "And who do you think I really am?" Mary studied his face with eyes that had seen 8 decades of life. "You're someone who left everything to be here when my family needed you. You're someone who looks at my granddaughter as if she were a miracle. And you're someone who is finally learning that real life doesn't happen in fancy offices." "Grandma," Alexander said, surprised by how easy it was to use the word, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do I know if I'm making the right decision? What decision? If I should leave my life in London, my company, everything I've built, for a possibility with Eleanor?" Mary smiled, and in that smile, Alexander saw generations of Cornish wisdom. "Son, when you're dying, you don't think about the money you made or the deals you closed. You think about the people you loved, and whether you were true to who you really were. And if I fail, and if I'm not good enough for her, then you will have failed honestly, instead of succeeding by being someone you're not." The conversation was interrupted by a nurse who indicated that visiting time was over. As Alexander stood up to leave, Mary took his hand with surprising strength. "Take care of my granddaughter," she murmured, "and let her take care of you. That's what people who truly love each other do." When Alexander left intensive care, he found Eleanor waiting for him in the hallway. "What did you talk about?" she asked. "About real life," Alexander replied, "and what truly matters." That night they stayed at the hospital, sleeping intermittently in the waiting room chairs. When Alexander woke at dawn, he found Eleanor awake beside him, looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. "Good morning," he murmured. "I love you," Eleanor said simply. The words floated in the air between them like something precious and fragile. Alexander felt as if something settled in his chest, as if a peace he had been searching for his whole life had finally found its place. "I love you too," he replied, and he knew it was the first time in his life that those words were completely true. They kissed there, in the hospital waiting room, surrounded by the sound of medical machines and whispered conversations, and it was the most honest and perfect kiss Alexander had ever given. When they separated, Eleanor smiled with tears in her eyes. "Do you know what this means? It means I have to make the most important decision of my life." "And what is it?" Alexander took a deep breath, feeling as if he was standing on the edge of the precipice he had been avoiding for weeks. "It means I'm going to sell my share of the company. It means I'm going to move to Truro. And it means I'm going to stake my entire life on the possibility that we can build something beautiful together." The smile that lit up Eleanor's face was like the sun rising after the longest storm of her life. 6 months later, Alexander found himself standing at the harbor in Land's End, watching as fishermen prepared their boats for the morning's work. The salty air filled his lungs, and the sound of seagulls mixed with the voices of the sailors speaking in Cornish. It was a ritual that had become part of his daily routine, these moments of contemplation before heading to his new office. The sale of his stake in the London company had been more complicated than he had anticipated. Smith had alternated between fury and disbelief. Clients had questioned his mental stability, and his mother had needed 3 long conversations to begin to understand his decision. But each obstacle overcome had strengthened his conviction that he was taking the right path. He now ran a small consultancy specializing in helping traditional Cornish businesses modernize their operations without losing their cultural identity. It was a job that combined his business experience with his new understanding of the value of preserving roots while growing towards the future. His phone vibrated with a message from Eleanor. "Ready for family lunch? Grandma's making her famous hake and green sauce." Alexander smiled. Mary had fully recovered from the heart attack and had adopted Alexander as if he were her own grandson. His Sundays now centered around long family meals where Cornish and English mixed, along with stories of the past and plans for the future. "On my way," he replied. "Hello, Grandma." Alexander had begun to learn Cornish seriously, taking classes 3 times a week with a private tutor. His progress was slow but steady, and each new word he mastered felt like a key unlocking another door to Eleanor's world. As he walked towards the Vance family home, he reflected on all the changes of the past few months. His apartment was now a small flat overlooking the river, decorated with a mix of his most cherished belongings from London and new acquisitions that reflected his Cornish life. Photographs of local landscapes, books in Cornish, a traditional Cornish cap that Joss had given him. His daily routine had changed completely. Instead of working breakfasts in expensive restaurants, he now began his days with coffee at Patty's bar. Instead of business dinners, he spent his evenings walking with Eleanor through the streets of Truro, discovering new corners of the city or visiting friends who had gradually become his friends too. When he arrived at the family home, the aroma of homemade food enveloped him like a warm hug. He found Mary in the kitchen, overseeing multiple pots while directing Eleanor and 2 cousins who had come for Sunday lunch. "Ah, the townie has arrived," Mary announced affectionately, using the nickname she had adopted for him. "Hello, Grandma," Alexander greeted, kissing her on the cheeks. "How are you?" "Very well," Mary replied, clearly pleased with his efforts in Cornish. "Your pronunciation is improving." Eleanor approached and kissed him softly. "How was your morning walk?" "Perfect. I saw 3 boats heading out to the Celtic Sea. Joss says conditions are ideal for fishing today." It was incredible how he had learned to find peace in these simple rhythms. The tides, the seasons, the cycles of work and rest that had governed Cornish life for millennia. During lunch, the conversation flowed between Cornish and English, between stories of the past and plans for the future. One of Eleanor's cousins announced that he would be getting married in the autumn. Another spoke about a new business he was starting. Alexander contributed to the conversations with a naturalness that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. "Alexander," Mary said suddenly, "have I told you the story of how your great-grandfather met your great-grandmother?" Alexander knew she was referring to her own grandparents and realized he had begun to think of Eleanor's family as his own extended family. "No, Grandma, tell me." It was 1956, and he was a young fisherman who had come from St. Ives to work on the boats in Land's End. She worked in the cannery, canning anchovies. Every day he would pass by the factory when he returned from the sea, just to watch her work through the windows. Alexander leaned forward, captivated as always by Mary's stories. For 3 months, he never dared to speak to her, until one day there was a terrible storm and several boats couldn't return to port. She stayed all night on the docks, waiting for news. When he finally arrived at dawn, he went straight to her and said, "I don't want you to worry about me like this ever again, unless it's your right to do so as my wife." "And what did she say?" Alexander asked. "She told him, 'Then you'd better propose properly, not when you smell of fish and seaweed.'" Mary laughed. "They got married 6 months later and were together for 50 years. Alexander looked at Eleanor, seeing in her eyes the reflection of the same questions that had begun to form in his own mind. 6 months of living together, of building a life in common, of discovering that their love was as real in daily routine as it had been in the dramatic moments at the hospital. After lunch, Eleanor and Alexander walked along the promenade in Land's End, watching as local families enjoyed the sunny Sunday. Children ran among the sculptures. Older couples sat on benches contemplating the sea. Teenagers played football in the green areas. "Do you regret it?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "Regret what?" "Leaving everything in London, changing your life so radically." Alexander stopped and took her in his arms, kissing her softly as seagulls cried overhead and the sound of waves provided a natural soundtrack. "Do you remember the first night we had dinner together?" he said when they separated. "You said that sometimes people who seem lost just need someone to show them the way home." "I remember. Well, it turns out I didn't need to find my way back home. I needed to find my way to the home I truly wanted." Eleanor smiled, that radiant smile that had illuminated his darkest days and made the best ones shine even brighter. "I have something to ask you," Alexander said, suddenly feeling nervous. "What?" "Do you remember you told me Cornish was the language of your heart?" "Yes." Alexander took a deep breath, and in the best Cornish he could muster, he said, "My agaskar, Eleanor. My avin rana albeunans gansti." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she mentally translated. "I love you, Eleanor. I want to share my whole life with you." "Ha my agaskar," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "And I love you too." "Then," Alexander said, switching back to English, "will you marry me?" Eleanor's answer was a kiss that tasted of future promises, shared adventures, and the deep joy of two people who had found not only love, but the most authentic version of themselves in the mirror of each other's eyes. When they separated, Alexander looked towards the horizon, where the Celtic Sea stretched to infinity, and realized that he had finally learned the difference between being successful and being happy. A year later, they married in a small, intimate ceremony on Porthcurno Beach, with the Cornish cliffs as witnesses and the sound of the sea as background music. Joss served as an impromptu best man. Mary cried tears of joy, and when they exchanged vows in Cornish and English, Alexander knew he had found not only the woman of his life, but the home he had never known he was looking for. Life had taught them that Turpunai wasn't just about finding the right person, but being willing to become the right person for the love you deserve. And as they danced their first dance as husband and wife to the rhythm of traditional Cornish music, with the Truro River sparkling under the evening lights and the Tate St. Ives gleaming in the distance like a beacon of infinite possibilities, Alexander whispered in Eleanor's ear, "Thank you, my heart's love, because sometimes getting completely lost is the only way to truly find yourself." If this extraordinary story moved and captivated you, please give us a like. Join our community by subscribing. Share this content with people you know, and tell us what you thought in the comments section. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing you more fascinating stories like this. Remember to activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories full of emotion and drama.